As we get started today, are there any concerns over just what we're doing? Did everybody find the guided reading handout? If you haven't, I think that's going to be a huge help for you. So please go to Blackboard, look under Lecture 2, and you'll find that handout that will guide you through this conversation, I think, in a very easy to follow, organized way. Last time, we were talking about the endocrine system, and we were kind of getting the tour, right? The tour of the glands, and we started with the hypothalamus, and we talked about all that it does and what it makes and how it responds. And then we looked primarily at the anterior pituitary, right? And we looked at the 7 different hormones that it makes. And this is that slide. What page is this on your notes? Just before where we stopped last time. Page number? No page number? No page number. Okay. Yeah, 16.7. Okay. But this is a nice slide. I know it's kind of small to look at on your handouts, but this kind of gives you the big overview of the hypothalamic hormones as well as the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. So this is a nice one to kind of stare at. Go to your book and stare at this picture, and this is something that should become very second nature to you, just kind of laying out this these hormones. You need to be able to identify, not necessarily to write out, but to recognize, right, where the hormones are coming from and where they're going to. So on the test, it'll be largely multiple choice, of course, but you'll need to be, when you see a hormone, you need to be able to answer, where did it come from, what made it, and what's it going to, what's it responding to, and then what does it do? So that's what you want to be pulling together as you think about organizing this material. So we talked about the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus makes a bunch of enzymes, and they all have what in their name? Releasing or inhibiting, right? And all of those releasing or inhibiting hormones go where? They all go to the anterior pituitary. And they all got there how? Do they go into the bloodstream and go all over your whole body? No, they go directly through that little portal system, right? Direct blood flow from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary. And the hypothalamus makes 2 other enzymes that don't have releasing or inhibiting in their name. Those are ADH and oxytocin, right? And they're released from the hypothalamus. And they also have a special route. They head down to the posterior pituitary, and they get there by special neurons that actually connect it down and dump that hormone into the posterior pituitary like a neuron. Okay? And so that's kind of where we picked up or dropped off last time. And then what are those 7 hormones? Name them off for me from the anterior pituitary in any order. LH and FSH. Those 2 hormones, because they go on to affect the gonads, are considered gonadotropins. Okay? And what else? Growth hormone. PRL, prolactin. TSH. ACTH, and finally melanocyte stimulating hormone. And that's the different one, right? 6 of them are made throughout our lifetime, and that MSH is only made during early development, influences our melanocytes, and then kind of shuts down and it's done with. Okay, very good. So we got that story going. And then we were going to start taking the journey through the glands. And we dropped off right about here with the thyroid gland. I described it to you as being a butterfly-shaped gland in the throat area, and that there were these big colloids, these big suspensions that are found there when you look at it histologically, and there was a special kind of cell called the C cells. And the C cells are clear, but they also make calcitonin. And calcitonin, we'll see, will be a very important hormone in regulating calcium, and we'll be talking about that quite a bit in the little bit of Chapter 6 that I want to get to next Tuesday. So we look again here in the thyroid. You take a slice through it, you're going to see these big colloid structures surrounded by a simple cuboidal epithelium, and the C cells are out here. They literally are clear in their staining, and those are making the calcitonin. And inside those colloids is where you're going to be making thyroxine. Thyroxine is abbreviated T4, And then there's also a triiodothyroxine or thyronin, and that's T3. Now the 3 and the 4 only refer to the number of iodines. One of the reasons that we need iodine in our diet, and we get plenty of it because about 100 years ago, Mr. Morton and the government got together and put iodine in our salt, right? So our salt is iodinated for the purpose of keeping our thyroids healthy. And we get plenty of iodine now in our diet from just the salt that we consume in our ketchup and everything else that's got salt in it. So there's no longer an iodide issue in our everyday diet. You go to other countries, though, where they don't have the iodinated salt or where there's some other kinds of deficiencies, and you will see goiters, big and large thyroid glands in the throat, which are the result of a deficiency in iodine. Okay, so iodine is very, very important to the thyroid function and to the making of T3 and T4. And again, the follicle cells are going to be helping to make, they're going to be taking this iodide in and making these T3 and T4 molecules. I'll show you that picture in a moment. Now, T4 is the primary one. 90% of your thyroid secretions are T4. The rest of it is T3. And those thyroid hormones are going to be released into your bloodstream. And what did we say that thyroid hormone did? What did the thyroid do? It was involved with your overall metabolism, right? And I told you that TSH did two things. TSH did what? Or what did, what did I tell you thyroid hormone did long ago? It was a mixed molecule, a small molecule, and it had the ability of being received. The receptor for that was inside the cell, and there were kind of two places where thyroid hormone went. It went to your nucleus to affect the transcription of genes related to your overall metabolism, but it also very specifically went into your mitochondria, right, and was involved with upregulating ATP energy and production. So remember that thyroid hormone, when I was talking about how hormones come in three flavors, they come in amino acid-like, peptide-like, and hormone-like. I talked a little bit about where thyroid hormone goes in the cell and how it acts on the receptor or on the target cell. Now, this is a special molecule. Think about this with me for a moment. If thyroid hormone can go straight through the cell membrane and into the cell, what does that tell you about thyroid hormone? Hydrophobic, hydrophilic? Is it more lipid-like or is it more protein-like? If it can go straight through the membrane, it must be more lipid, fatty-like. And if it's a fatty-like molecule, can it travel through the plasma of the blood by itself?
Nope.
No, right? It's going to have to be, quote, carried. Okay? So, again, when you're thinking about these hormones, if it's a lipid-like molecule that can go straight into the cell membrane and affect the nucleus or inside the cell, that molecule, although it can directly go into the cell, has to be, quote, carried through the plasma. So we're going to see this as a distinction. So this is the hormone we talked about that can go straight into the cell. So it's actually carried. It's carried through the blood through a transport protein called thyroid binding globulin. Okay, so it kind of tells you what it does, right? It binds up the thyroid. Globulin tells you that it's a, quote, globular, round kind of protein. It ends in IN, globulin. So you know it's a protein. It's kind of round in shape, and it binds thyroid and carries it around the bloodstream. Okay? And so if you were going to measure your thyroid levels in your blood, you would want to measure your free thyroid hormone, because the amount of thyroid that's bound up to the carrier, is that available to the cells? So think about it. You're a little thyroid molecule, and you're going to hitch a ride on this protein. As long as you're attached to that protein, you can't go into the cell, can you? So you're only going to be measuring your free thyroid. The amount of thyroid hormone that is bound up to the carrier is biologically unavailable at the moment. Okay, so we'll be thinking about how these hormones are traveling through your body. So your bloodstream contains about a week's supply or so of thyroid hormone. This is being released from your thyroid gland consistently. Here's a little picture of this to help you think through this. So on the bottom, here's your capillary. Okay, so there's your blood supply on the bottom. And we need to get T3 and T4 out of that follicle cell by diffusion into the bloodstream. Now, where did that get made? Okay, so up here, this is where the thyroglobulin is, and it's going to catch a ride. It's going to add some iodine to it and make that hormone. It's going to go up into the cell, come back out, and again, by diffusion, end up in your bloodstream. Now, the iodine is also going to be transported. So the iodine ions are going to be actively transported into the cytoplasm of the cell as well. So the iodine gets converted, 3 of them on T3, 4 of them on T4, and this will be important. When you hear about iodine, think thyroid gland. Okay, this will be an important connection. So what does it do? We've already talked about how it is involved with energy. If you have more thyroid, it can also raise your body temperature. Okay? It can increase your heart rate. It can increase your sensitivity to sympathetic stimulation. It can increase your respiratory centers. I mean, there's a lot of overall effects that thyroid hormone can have. It can stimulate red blood cell production and therefore more oxygen delivery. So again, when you think about thyroid hormone, think about increasing more ATP, more energy, but even more oxygen available to your tissues. So individuals who have a thyroid deficiency, who are hypothyroid, would complain about being what? Kind of sluggish, right? Not very much energy, kind of sluggish. Their overall metabolism might be decreased. They might see some weight gain as a result of that. Even some mood-changing things. There are a lot of things that the thyroid gland and the thyroid hormones are critical to. Okay. Even accelerated turnover of minerals in the bone. So, I mean, there's just so much. Now, when I say turnover of minerals in the bone, what minerals am I talking about? Calcium and phosphate, right? And we know that calcium is also important in action potentials, and we'll talk about it in muscle muscle contraction coming up. So even that calcium availability is a little bit involved with thyroid hormone. So lots and lots of activities. So when you think about thyroid gland, think about iodine, think about energy. Also speaking about calcium is the parathyroid gland. This gland, little tiny glands. Most of us have 4. Some may only have 2, some may have 6, but 2 to 6 little glands on the posterior side of your thyroid gland, and they are very easily, all they're going to do is make parathyroid hormone. Okay, this shows the ideal 4, 2 on each side. These little purple circles are the parathyroid glands. Okay. And simple enough, they're going to make parathyroid hormone. There's actually 2 kinds of cells in the parathyroid. I don't know why they always tell us this. Some are the oxyphil cells, and we have no idea what they're doing. Right? So there's still a lot of things in cell biology we don't understand. But we know there's 2 clearly different types of cells in the parathyroid. One we don't know. The one we do know about are the chief cells. In some books just call them the parathyroid cells because they make the parathyroid hormone. We're not trying to make this difficult. So this parathyroid hormone is going to increase your calcium levels. Calcitonin, made by the C cells of the thyroid gland, is the yin-yang hormone here. So this is the yin-yang. We've got calcitonin by the thyroid. We've got parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland. These 2 hormones are going to work antagonistically, just like insulin and glucagon do, to maintain your calcium levels. Parathyroid will increase your calcium levels, whereas, so when your calcium levels are low, parathyroid gland will be released, and that will increase your calcium. When calcium is too high, calcitonin will be released from your thyroid and drive it back down. Okay, so calcitonin, parathyroid, back and forth. And I'm going to tell you more about this story in that little bit of chapter 6 on skeletal bone homeostasis that we'll talk about next Tuesday. So I'm not going to ask you about the histology here, but within this little gland, there are the cells, and you can actually see that when you look at this image, here is one of those thyroid follicles, right? The thyroid gland is all around this thing. These are those colloid structures within the thyroid. And then here's this big visiting gland, right? This parathyroid, right in the middle of the thyroid gland. And again, cells in there make the parathyroid hormone. So here's that story again. I've already said it to you. Parathyroid, calcitonin. Parathyroid, calcitonin. Opposing effects. If you remove the thyroid gland, what would happen? People have their thyroid gland removed, right, because it's cancer or something. And so their thyroid no longer can make thyroxine and the thyroid hormone. They'll just get supplements for that. That usually is okay. But they would also lose their calcitonin availability, wouldn't they? So what would happen perhaps to their calcium metabolism if you lost your thyroid gland? What did I tell you? Calcitonin was produced when calcium was too high. Calcitonin would push it back down. So a person without a thyroid gland may have what problems? Too high a calcium, right? So they may develop what? Bone spurs. I'm thinking maybe kidney stones, things where calcium is going to start accumulating at high concentrations, right? And so they might have some issues with that as a result. So here's the connection between the two. This is a nice chart to pull the whole story together. So we're looking at the thyroid gland producing calcitonin. This is all about calcium in this story. So at the very top, we're talking about thyroid gland producing calcitonin. On the bottom, we're referring to the parathyroid gland secreting the hormone PTH. So watch this chart. The normal numbers, I'm not going to ask you clinically what the average number is of calcium, but it is something that is very, very important. Clearly, how much calcium you have is critical, like I've said, to your action potentials and your nervous system, and we'll see the importance of calcium as we get into blood clotting, and we'll also see the importance of calcium in muscle contraction. So we thought for a while we were talking about so much about sodium and potassium. Calcium also is extremely important in your overall homeostasis. Okay, so these little charts are nice. They kind of read through and help you with this as far as understanding what these different hormones are doing. Let's go on to the next one, the adrenal glands. We'll stay here for a little bit longer. What do we know about the adrenal glands? There's two parts. The outer layer is called the cortex, right? The inside is called the medulla or the medulla. The cortex has layers to it that we'll be looking at, and everything made from the adrenal cortex is going to be a steroid, okay? So there's a bunch of steroids, lipid-based hormones, that will be made by the cortex. And then the medulla, the center of the adrenal gland, will have a completely different job. The adrenal gland is much like the pituitary gland. Remember, the pituitary gland had the neuro part on the back, the posterior, and it had the glandular part in the front, the anterior pituitary. Same thing, the adrenal glands are really like two separate things squished together. The outside is making steroid hormones. The inside, we'll see, will be making things like epinephrine. So the adrenal glands are also called the suprarenal glands. It makes sense, doesn't it? Supra, above, renal, kidney, suprarenal, or adrenal. What does AD mean? Next to, right? Next to the renal. So we see the adrenal or suprarenal. You'll see both names sometimes used to describe these glands. They are retroperitoneal, just like the kidneys. What does that tell us? They're behind the peritoneum, right? Retroperitoneum, they're back behind. They're up against the abdominal wall, just like the kidneys are. Like most endocrine glands, very rich in blood supply. That makes sense. They're receiving and sending out hormones. There better be a lot of blood supply in those organs. And a lot of fat. So if you look at the kidneys, any picture of the kidneys in the adrenal glands, you'll always see the red kidney with the yellow fatty top. There is a good layer of fat around the adrenal glands. Part of that is because, what are they making? The cortex is making all those steroid hormones, those lipid-like. So they need some fat supply. So there's a nice supply of fat right there sitting next to the adrenal glands. Again, the layers. The outer layer, there's a little capsule But what we really care about is the cortex, the outer region, and there are 24, 25, maybe perhaps even more steroid hormones that will be made there. They're going to be collectively called the corticosteroids. Cortico because they're coming from the cortex of the adrenal gland, right? Corticosteroids. You hear about them all the time, right? People take corticosteroids for different reasons. These hormones collectively are going to have huge effects, and they're vital to life. These are critical. We're going to be talking about a few of these hormones, and you're going to start to see, oh, these all have some very important functions. The inside, the center of the adrenal gland, is the medulla or the medulla. And there we'll see that it's really just a big production of epinephrine and norepinephrine. And what kind of molecules do we call epinephrine and norepinephrine? Going back to the first few slides. What class of molecules, what class of, starts with a C? Catecholamines, right? Catecholamines include epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So we got some catecholamines being made there in the adrenal medulla. So again, just to get that picture that you've seen of these before, here's the kidney, and again, that big, fatty gland is embedded in the fat on the superior border of the kidney. If you cut open the adrenal gland, you would see, again, this center area, the medulla, and this cortical region surrounding the whole thing. The cortex, the outer layer, is divided into 3 zones, 3 layers. Hang on as I go through this. The outer layer is called the zone, glomerulosa. Glomerulosa. Sounds a lot like what? Glomerulus, right? Glomerulosa. And this outer area is making a subset of corticosteroids called the mineralocorticoids. The big one that you need to remember from here is aldosterone. All of the hormones in this outer layer are somehow involved with mineral control, and the big one will be aldosterone. Now, we saw aldosterone a little bit in passing with the water content, but it increases reabsorption of sodium and water, and especially in the presence of ADH. So in that first chapter, chapter 25, when we're talking about water and sodium balance and ADH, aldosterone flashed before our eyes back in that time. It also accelerates the loss of potassium. We'll come back and talk about this renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, a really, really important hormone control system that the zona glomerulosa is involved with. The middle layer of the cortex is called the zona fasciculata. Here, the hormones are glucosteroids. These are steroids involved with sugar metabolism. So the outside was minerals. The middle layer is going to be glucose corticosteroids. And the two here, the one you're going to hear about the most, is cortisol. Okay, cortisol is the hormone here. Also corticosterone. If it ends in "one," aldosterone, corticosterone, all these are these hormones made, many of them made by the cortex. We're going to see that this is stimulated by ACTH. So where did we see this before? ACTH is being made by anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary. ACTH stands for what? Adrenocorticotropin hormone, right? It's going to influence the adrenal cortex. And one of the major players that it's going to influence is this release of cortisone or cortisol. Now, what do these hormones do? These glucocorticoids, they're going to affect glucose metabolism. Mostly, they are going to increase the rate of liver glucose formation. Did you know your liver can make sugar? Okay, so your liver can actually make sugar out of other metabolites in order to help regulate your blood sugar. So when you're having a low blood sugar moment, your liver can make sugar, okay? Because your brain requires glucose. And if your brain doesn't have glucose, it shuts down. It has to have particularly glucose. It can't use other sugar types. So when your metabolism is such that you don't have enough glucose for your brain, your liver will make some for you. It also is going to increase the rate of glycogen formation. Glycogen is storing some sugar. It's going to stimulate the release of amino acids from your muscles. It's going to release lipids from your adipose tissue. What does it sound like it's doing? It's releasing energy molecules, isn't it? Okay. It's all involved with energy, and it's going to promote lipid metabolism. All of these are going to supplement glucose-sparing effects. Now, what that means is this. I just told you the brain requires glucose. If your other tissues use up all the glucose, your brain goes without. So your glucocorticoids are going to help make sure that there is glucose-sparing effects, so that there's always glucose available for your brain. And cortisol also has an anti-inflammatory effect. So you'll hear about cortisol sometimes in a inflammatory conversation. Let's keep going through these layers. The inside layer of the cortex is called the reticularis. Now, here we're releasing androgens, sex hormones. Sex hormones. Women make testosterone. The testosterone that women make comes from this layer, from the reticularis layer. So guys also make some from here. Obviously, guys make most of their testosterone from the testes, but there's also some androgen and some testosterone made here. That testosterone is then converted to estrogen. So guess what? Guys also make estrogen, right? Not from our ovaries. We don't have those. But from the testosterone that is converted to estrogens within the cortex. And so but all the sexes have all of the hormones, just in different amounts. Again, this is also going to be stimulated by ACTH. Okay? ACTH again. One way of remembering this, let me back up. One way of remembering this is GFR, the three layers, okay, GFR. We'll talk about GFR as a term, and it means glomerular filtration rate. It may not mean anything to you right now, but GFR, the three layers, glomerulosa, the fasciculata, and the reticularis. These three layers, salt, sugar, sex. Okay? So as far as the three layers, what hormones are they making? The glomerulosa is making salt, mineral corticosteroids. The middle layer, fasciculatus, is making sugar, glucose corticoids. And the reticularis is making the sex hormones. So salt, sugar, sex, those three are the primary way of remembering. That's how I remember these three layers. Now, once you get to the inside of the adrenal gland, now you're in the medulla, and as we've already said, that's going to make and secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. And what are these hormones going to do? Well, just like you expect, when the bear is chasing you and you're releasing epinephrine, heart rate's going to go up, blood pressure's going to go up, you're going to have more energy released to fight or flight. Okay, and that's going to be stimulated in response to sympathetic nervous system stimulation. Again, this is one of those major connections between the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system, is this adrenal medulla. So looking at the histology of this, I'm not going to ask you to label these layers, but here's what we've got. We're looking at the adrenal gland, and here is the cortex, and here are three clear different layers. So here's the glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis. They're pretty obvious even when you're looking at them. And the cells within those three layers make the salt, sugar, and sex-specific hormones. And then when you get down to the medullary area, to the medulla, that's where you're making epinephrine and norepinephrine. Nice little table to remember all this. Again, mineral corticoids, glucocorticoids, and the androgens, or the sex hormones, are made in those 3 layers, and then epinephrine and norepinephrine from the medulla. So that's a nice table to refer to as well as a good global table. Okay, so that's our little quick journey through the adrenal glands. Going on to the pancreas, another very important endocrine gland. Overall, gross anatomy, where do you find the pancreas? Toward the back a little bit. Remember the fetal pigs? Where did you find the pancreas? Kind of lifted up the stomach, pulled down on the intestines. It was kind of way back there, right? So it's way back there. It's kind of in between the kidneys in a way. A part of it is retroperitoneal. A part of it is in the abdominal pelvic cavity. It's kind of a long, lumpy-looking gland. It's kind of whitish in color and texture. And it kind of just kind of runs between, I always think of it kind of being back there right in front of and between the 2 kidneys. Now, the pancreas has 2 very different functions. Again, this is like a gland, a single structure that has 2 totally different parts to it. Just like the pituitary had the neuro and the adrenal part, and just like the medulla and the cortex of the adrenal gland. The pancreas has an endocrine and an exocrine function. The exocrine function, right, what we're not going to be talking about much today, is what 99% of the kidney is doing. Most of what the kidney is doing is related to your digestion, releasing enzymes related to overall digestion of products. And those products dump into the intestine as soon as food comes through your stomach. Your stomach churns up the food, makes that chyme, that pasty, liquidy substance, and that liquidy substance gets squirted through the pyloric sphincter. As you begin the journey through the duodenum, do you remember that's where the pancreas and the bile ducts from the gallbladder dumped into the duodenum? Okay? So right there, as soon as food dumps into the duodenum, the pancreas spits out all these enzymes involved with digestion. It also releases a lot of bicarbonate, which is going to be important for neutralizing. Because what's the pH of the stuff coming out of the stomach? Pretty acidic, right? So the stuff coming out of the stomach is going to be very acidic, and so we need to neutralize that. So very alkaline, right? Lots of enzymes, very alkaline. That's what's being dumped directly into the intestine. That's the exocrine part. That's a digestive story. What we want to focus on is the other little 1% of the pancreas that releases hormones. And that's, quote, the endocrine pancreas. If you talk to an endocrinologist, they'll say the endocrine pancreas, right? You talk to a gastroenterologist, they'll talk about the exocrine pancreas. And honestly, everything the pancreas is doing is involved with digestion, somehow regulating the speed of and the utilization of energy and molecules, but in 2 different ways. Scattered within the pancreas are these little islands of cells. They're called the islets. Okay, you can think of them as being little islands. The islets, and they were named after a guy named Langerhans. Okay, so the islets of Langerhans. And these little clusters of cells are the cells that are making the hormones that we'll be discussing. There's about 2 million of these little islets within a typical pancreas. So here's the pancreas, and I was just trying to give you that story. Maybe now you can see it more clearly. Stomach right here just dumped food into, or chyme, into the pyloric sphincter right here. And as soon as that chyme comes into the duodenum, here comes the pancreas, and here comes the substance, the bile, down from the gallbladder and the liver. And it dumps right into the beginning of the small intestine called the duodenum. So that's when I think about the exocrine pancreas, that's the story I'm thinking about. The hormones, though, would not be released into the gut, would they? The hormones would be released into the bloodstream. So these islets of Langerhans will be dumping their hormones into the bloodstream and going through the vascular system. Now these little islands, these little islets, there's different cells in these little clusters. There are alpha cells and beta cells. So not too bad. The alpha cells make glucagon. The beta cells make insulin. Now that's the first one. When you think of the pancreas, most of you probably think of insulin. That's probably the first thing that kind of associates with the pancreas. So these little tiny these little islets of Langerhans clusters, some of those are beta cells, and those beta cells make the insulin. What is the job of insulin? To encourage the uptake of sugar, or another way of thinking about it, to lower your blood sugar. So you just had a Snickers bar. You got a higher blood sugar level. The pancreas senses that, sends out insulin, and what that insulin basically tells all the cells of your body to do is eat, right? There's a meal available. Get hungry. Start eating, if you will. Take that glucose out of the bloodstream and feed the cells. As a result, the blood sugar comes down. The cells now have gotten the energy that they need. Now, the opposite of insulin is glucagon. Glucagon is made by the other cells, the alpha cells that are also part of these islets. So the opposite is true. When you haven't had a meal for a while and your blood sugar is coming down, the alpha cells will release glucagon. That glucagon is going to tell your body you need more sugar and do other mechanisms to raise your sugar back to a reasonable level. But that's not all. There are also delta cells within the islets, and they're going to release growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Okay, so that's a different hormone. Okay, growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And what this is going to do is suppress the release of both glucagon and insulin. Kind of interesting. It has an effect on both of those hormones. And what it's really doing is slowing down the rate of absorption. In other words, this stuff is kind of controlling the speed that food goes through the intestine and kind of controls the absorption rate of the nutrients. You want your food, you want your digestive products to pass through your gut slow enough so that your cells can absorb the nutrients, but fast enough that it doesn't rot along the way, right? There's kind of a perfect timing of this system. And the delta cells and what it produces has a lot to do with sort of the rate of movement through your gut. Then there are F cells. There's no E. Okay, so it's alpha, beta, delta. There's also no C, right? So it's delta. We kind of skip a couple. And then we get to the F cells. They're producing another hormone called the pancreatic polypeptide. I wish they just called it P cells. It'd be easier, right? It'd make more sense. But what these are going to do is inhibit gallbladder contraction and regulate, again, some of the pancreatic enzymes. And they're also going to help control the rate of nutrient absorption. So within a islet, what we're looking at here, this is one of those islets, lots and lots of them within the pancreas. Most of all the cells around this islet are normal old exocrine digestive pancreatic cells. And within these little islands or islets, there's a mixture of these alpha, beta, delta, and F cells. And you can't tell one from the other, okay? And we're not going to ask you to know one from another. Just know that within these little islands, there are alpha, beta, delta, and F cells that are making these hormones, and these would have direct connection to blood supply as they release their hormones. All of these hormones, insulin, glucagon, the growth hormone, inhibiting hormone, and the pancreatic peptide are all involved, like I said, with kind of overall regulating your metabolism related to glucose metabolism. The word I'm going to use to describe insulin and glucagon is that they are antagonistic. Okay? They work opposite. What other hormones I've already said are antagonistic? Calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, right? Those are antagonistic, yin-yang, and insulin and glucagon are yin-yang. They're antagonistic hormones. As we said, as blood glucose goes up, insulin is released. That lowers your blood sugar. When blood glucose goes down, the alpha cells release glucagon, and that is going to stimulate the release of energy stores from your liver and from your cells. So again, here's a nice little table. Just like the calcitonin parathyroid table, this table is really nice just to get this idea of how the beta cells release insulin and how the alpha cells release glucagon and how they're related and how they're used to maintain your blood glucose. So you really want to focus on, honestly, focus on the insulin and the glucagon. Okay, that's the big story here. I'm going to skip over the video because they don't play well, as you know, but definitely take a moment to watch this little bioflix. It's nice. It pulls the whole story for you together. Okay, that's our quick tour through the pancreas. We're not staying very long any place, right? We're just kind of getting the whole story put together. The pineal gland. This is up in the brain in what's called the epithalamus. So a little area, quote, on the thalamus, kind of more posterior. And in here are some cells, not very surprising, pinealocytes, right? Little cells that make up the pineal gland. And they are all about producing a hormone called melatonin. And I mentioned this earlier. They produce melatonin, and the melatonin is actually made by serotonin. So this is interesting. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter. We'll talk about it along the way. But serotonin is actually the precursor to this melatonin. They kind of have the same ending, don't they? Serotonin, melatonin. That's a nice way to connect them. And this hormone is involved with your circadian rhythm, your 24-hour clock. And people take melatonin supplements when they're traveling overseas to help kind of reset their jet lag. Okay, so you'll see melatonin in the health food aisle. And just to get an idea of where this is, we got the thalamus right here, and right here, really small, little pine cone shaped gland, the pineal gland. Don't worry about the histology of it. Now, we think it also has a timing issue with overall puberty. We know that the hypothalamus wakes up and starts releasing gonadotropin-releasing hormone. And gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, would do what? It would go down to the anterior pituitary and would likely do what? Turn on some of the gonadotropes like LH and FSH, and that's going to have a lot to do with the turning on of the ovaries for the onset of ovarian cycles in women and also the onset of puberty in guys. But what turns on the hypothalamus? And we think it might be the pineal gland. So, you know, what starts what? So we think it may have a role in, because we know that melatonin levels decline at puberty. So it's almost like they kind of rise, and they kind of, when they get to the top, okay, time for puberty to start. And then they start to drop down a little bit. If you have a pineal tumor that stops making melatonin, then this can cause premature issues in puberty as well. So there's definitely something to do with puberty and the onset of puberty related to the pineal gland. We also know that the pineal gland has an important role in protecting against free radicals. So when we breathe, I mean, you know, when we breathe oxygen and other molecules, there are free radicals that are made. That's kind of a chemical thing. But those free radicals we know are dangerous to us. They can cause damage to our DNA. They can cause mutations. And we think that the pineal gland has a role in protecting the brain, the CNS, from these free radicals. Things like hydrogen peroxide, things like nitric oxide, and they could be damaging to the cells and to the DNA. And like I said, circadian rhythms. Okay, so it's a cyclic release. That cyclic release is kind of common. Many of your hormones are actually released in a cyclic way. They have peaks and valleys, and that's an important thing that we'll get to later on about their release. They're not just on constantly. They're released up and down, up and down, up and down. So at the end of this chapter, we'll talk about why that is. Melatonin is secreted more during the darkness. And we think, too, that it has an effect on SAD, seasonal affective disorder. Many of you may be kind of suffering from the winter blues right now. And we used to think it was just a phenomenon, but we now actually have a diagnosis of SAD, right? Seasonal affective disorder. And we know that less light, less melatonin, maybe can get you into a little funk. So what do? sit under lights, right? So there's actually, you can actually sit under lights and help to boost your melatonin levels and hopefully also increase your mood. So we got a little bit of reproduction going on, inhibiting reproductive functions. We've got damage against free radicals, and we've got the circadian rhythm story with melatonin. Okay, so that's our march through the endocrine organs and the hormones produced and what their major functions are in the body. Now I want to tell you a little bit about diabetes. It's probably the #1 endocrine disorder, something we've all heard of. There's a couple different types of diabetes. The term mellitus actually comes from honey. The way that this disease was diagnosed historically was if urine caused ants, okay, because diabetics have more sugar in their urine. And so if the urine was sweet and caused ants to be brought to it, then that was sort of part of the diagnosis in the day of diabetes. And so that's where the wording comes from. There can be either inadequate insulin production. What cells are in trouble if you're not making enough insulin? The beta cells, right? So if the beta cells are low or destroyed, you wouldn't have enough insulin. That would be one type of diabetes. Or there can be an issue with the insulin receptor. Remember, and I haven't talked about it too much, but hormones are only effective if a cell has a receptor for that hormone. And so type 2 diabetes, the issue there is that the receptors are no longer functioning normally. There may be plenty of insulin being released by the body and by the pancreas and the beta cells. They're okay. But the body doesn't see that insulin because the receptors are faulty. And that's more of a type 2 type. Overall, though, both situations give you high sugar. In type 1 diabetes, you have high sugar because you don't have insulin, right? Because what does insulin do? Drives your glucose levels back down. So if you don't have the beta cells, your blood glucose stays high. Now the problem is, over time, we know that high sugar levels in the blood has effects on the cardiovascular system. And that high sugar, over time, destroys nerves and destroys microvascular structures like the capillaries. And so individuals with high glucose for a long time start having issues with their sight. Right? You hear about diabetics going blind. Their capillaries in their eye are affected by the high sugar. They have nerve damage. That's going to be, again, high sugar. And they have kidney damage. And they get the capillaries within the glomerulus get affected by that high glucose. So there's a lot of issues with the cardiovascular system and diabetes. A person with diabetes is going to be said to have hyperglycemia, right? High level of blood glucose. Usually they'll have glucoseuria, which means that they'll have urine showing up in their, or the glucose showing up in their urine. And we'll do this lab when we get to the end of the semester. We'll do a glucose urine lab, and you'll see the impact of that in urine studies. So urea, right? High sugar in the urine, and they'll have excessive urination. They'll have polyuria. Why would that be? Why do you think there's a higher urination?
To get rid of the sugar.
Say it again?
To get rid of the sugar.
To get rid of the sugar. Okay. What did we learn in lab number 2 of Biology 105? Solutes suck. So if there's more sugar in the urine, right, more sugar in the kidney fluid, then more water will be drawn toward that glucose. Right? So more glucose in the urine will cause more water to be released, and that's what gives you that polyuria, the excessive urination. So let's go through the 2 types again, or there's actually more than 2, but I'll talk about those first. Type 1 diabetes. Okay, this used to be called juvenile diabetes, no longer, just type 1 diabetes. This is inadequate insulin production from the beta cells. We don't understand why. There might be a slight genetic thing. It might be more of an autoimmune disease. It could be set off by some sort of viral infection. We don't understand why this is. But for some reason, the beta cells are destroyed and the insulin is no longer produced. These individuals must rely upon injection or infusion by a pump for daily life for the insulin levels. This is a smaller percentage. 5 to 10% of your diabetes cases will be type 1. Again, it used to be called juvenile diabetes because it typically would be at onset in kids or young adults. Not always. Type 2 diabetes, most common type. These folks, at least initially, are making normal amounts of insulin. So there's no problem with their beta cells. The problem here is that their tissues don't respond to the insulin properly because they don't have the right receptor. So they get what's called insulin resistance. Their cells are resistant to the effects of the insulin. So again, they still have high blood sugar, right? Because the body's not taking in the sugar. It's not getting the signal to consume the sugar the way that it should. And this type of diabetes is more associated with obesity, and we know that it can be treated with meds and diet and exercise. But again, we don't really know if it's the obesity that causes the diabetes or if the diabetes may be contributing to the obesity, and there's this big cycle, this big sort of endless cycle of research, and that is not really clear. The medications are going to typically alter the amount of glucose made by the liver. Your liver, like I said, can make glucose. So one of the ways we can do this is tell the liver to stop making that glucose, and that's what some of the most common meds are. There's new meds now on the market. You're hearing, and they're talking about how they're affecting the kidneys. Okay? So if you're diabetic, what do you want to do? You want to get rid of more sugar out of your blood. So type 2 diabetics, there's now a new medication that's actually targeting the sugar receptors in the kidney and actually having you urinate more sugar out. Okay? And so that's good, right? Because it's the high sugar in the blood that causes the long-term effects. The long-term damage is by the high sugar. So a diabetic has to be aware of their sugar levels because long-term, it's not going to hurt them in the short term necessarily, but long-term, they can have some real nasty complications. Now, the numbers are huge. This is something that is very universal. I mean, it really can disrupt many, many different systems. And if you're type 1, you're not going to live without that insulin. So this is usually a crisis when a person is first diagnosed with type 1. It's usually very much a crisis and a very sudden type thing that happens. Type 2 diabetes, people can walk around for years without knowing that they have type 2 diabetes. But again, the sooner one is treated, the sooner one is put on medications, the sooner one can keep their blood sugar under control, less likely they'll have long-term complications. So as I mentioned, we can get some diabetic retinopathy, a disease of the eye. Again, blindness caused by damage to the capillaries from that high sugar. There can be an increased risk of heart attack, 3 to 5 times greater for people with diabetes. And again, that comes down to the microcirculation. So capillary issues around the cardiac muscle can lead to the heart attacks. And then the nephropathy, damage to the kidneys. It's all about capillaries, right? High blood sugar causes damage to capillaries in the eye, the kidney, and in the heart, all leading to the combination of these diseases. And it could also lead to other vascular issues like stroke. Again, capillaries, blood flow, brain, you name it, it has devastating effects on the capillaries. There's also, with that neuropathy, there can be abnormal flow to the neurotissues, and this can also cause damage to the distal limbs, especially to the toes and to the feet. And this can lead to a lack of blood flow, sensation, greater damage to the feet and to the toes. Diabetics lose feeling in their extremities, and they may have, for example, a pebble in their shoe, and they don't feel it, right? You and me, we would kick off the shoe and get the pebble out of there. They don't feel it, and so that pebble causes an ulcer, it causes a sore, and they don't have good blood flow, so guess what? There's not good regeneration of the tissues. And they can take off their shoes and without feeling it have a hole in their foot, right? That is bleeding or not bleeding because there's not much blood flow, so they don't bleed that much sometimes, and they don't feel the pain. So a diabetic should, especially a person who gets to this stage in diabetes, should absolutely change their socks every day, wear white socks, and have a mirror at their bed. So that when they get out of bed, swing their feet over the bed, look down at the mirror, look at the bottom of their feet. Right? Make sure that their feet are clear of any kind of ulcerations or wounds. That's just a good general routine thing for diabetics to do. Okay, so they have a lot of amputations because of this necrosis of their tissues. Again, weight is oftentimes associated with this. Okay, so that's our little journey. What do you think? Any clarifications right now on any of the glands or the hormones? We're not going into terrible detail here. It's kind of the big idea for most of these hormones. Anything to clarify or anything about diabetes? There's also another kind of diabetes related to pregnancy and during gestation, but I didn't go into that one. Yes?
Why is it often that diabetics or pre-diabetics have hypoglycemia before they're hyperglycemic?
Why do some...
It seems like a tendency that it's a precursor for diabetes type 2, that if you have hypoglycemia, that you...
I just know like the syndrome, what they call syndrome X, right? There's a high cholesterol, high lipids, and marginally high sugar. Those are the three indicators that are like you're pre-diabetic. And it used to be that diabetes, I don't know about the hypoglycemia to be honest, it's nothing's triggering right now. It used to be though that a blood sugar of 140 or higher after fasting was considered diabetic, and they've lowered it. So they've actually lowered it now down to like 120, 110. So the idea is we're catching more and more people early, getting them on medications, getting them the education they need to minimize the long-term effects. So we don't wait till someone has a blood sugar of 140 anymore to say that they're diabetic. We pushed it back down, trying to catch more people. Yes?
I have hypoglycemia, and I've had it since I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, my pancreas produces too much insulin.
Too much
all
insulin.
the time.
Right.
So my normal blood sugar is 60 to 120. Mine stays around 60 to 70. So I eat all the time. But what happens is over a period of time and over the years, even with adults, your pancreas gets tired. And
Right.
it just basically just doesn't want to produce, or your body gets tired of intaking it, doesn't recognize it over a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when you are obese, that puts a lot of pressure on your body, because your body has to work 10 times as hard to keep up because you're overweight, or because my pancreas is working all the time. So that's why, because
Yeah,
when you
it
get
is,
older,
yeah.
your pancreas isn't working right.
Right.
So either not producing insulin, or your body's just not
Responding.
able to use it.
Right.
So you have to give it to yourself, or you take like metformin or something
Right.
like that to help you.
Sometimes a type 2 diabetic will become insulin dependent. And the reason is, there was nothing wrong with their beta cells in the beginning, we don't think, right? It just that their beta cells have been making insulin, and they've actually been making it in high amounts. But the body wasn't seeing it, wasn't responding to it. So again, the pancreas gets tired, right? It just poops out, the beta cells get tired. And so a person who's a type 2 diabetic can become insulin dependent if after years their pancreas is pooped and not making that
Usually
insulin.
they're on metformin and insulin both, and usually
Yep.
hyperglycemia, they'll be on like a short acting.
There's all sorts of
insulin,
combinations,
like
yeah.
Humalog or something
Right.
like that. And then they'll also be on a long-term insulin while they sleep at night.
Right.
So when they lose weight and their health is better, there's not as much.
Right.
What we're learning is that adipose tissue makes a lot of hormones. And adipose, the more fat there is in the body, some of these adipose hormones are definitely interacting with and contributing to the problem of diabetes. And so by losing weight, those hormone signals, and we're not completely understanding them, we're getting better. But there's a whole bunch of hormones that speak to, from the adipose cells, that speak to the pancreas and speak to the brain and speak to your hunger levels and into your digestive system. But it's very complex. It really is. There's a lot going on here. I'm just trying to give us the big up story. I think though, when you're saying with the hypoglycemia, it is possible though that your body's just responding differently to the insulin, if there's some endocrine issue.
Usually if they get it early, like when you've been overweight for a long period of time, and they get it early, diet and exercise, and then the metformin
Right.
can help. And then when you lose the weight, typically, especially like somebody my age or 50, they lose all that weight, and then their bodies go back to normal.
Mhm.
But sometimes, the older you get,
Right. Well, also, if you're losing weight, you're probably also gaining some muscle, right? And so what's muscle doing? Muscle's highly metabolic. So by exercising, what are you doing? You're encouraging your muscle cells to take up some of that glucose. So, by losing weight and by increasing activity, increasing the activity of your muscles, you're sucking some of that glucose out of the blood and into your muscles for cellular respiration. And so those are the simple way to think about mechanisms that are going to help that diabetic become kind of stay in that pre-diabetic stage or even kind of wipe it out. But you'll hear it said that diabetes cannot be reversed. There are patients who have had gastric bypass who can sort of put diabetes on the back shelf for 10, 20 years, but they still have the tendency toward that condition. But you can definitely slow down the effects of diabetes by diet, exercise, and medications. Gestational diabetes during pregnancy, some women are prone to diabetes, and if they do have gestational diabetes, I forget the numbers, but I think it's as high as 50%, don't quote me on this, but as high as 50% of women who have gestational diabetes will themselves develop type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an indicator that when your body, you've been stressed during gestation, during pregnancy, and it's a sign that your body is likely to tilt toward type 2 diabetes later in life. I think it's as much as 50%. So if you have gestational diabetes, it's a good warning, right, to keep exercise and keep the weight off as much as possible to keep diabetes at bay. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about how this all goes together a little bit. I'm going to go through just a couple other endocrine disorders, and I'm also going to go through how hormones work with each other. I've already used this term, antagonistic, right? So sometimes hormones have opposite effects, and they're constantly, and the two examples I'm giving you here are the same two I've already told you about, PTH versus calcitonin, and glucagon versus insulin. When you think of hormones, when you think of homeostasis, that's pretty easy to think about. Now, I also want you to remember that cells don't just have one kind of receptor, and cells don't respond to just one kind of hormone, that this is a very complex arrangement. So every cell in your body would have insulin receptors, many of them, and they would also have glucagon receptors. And they'd be responding to these yin-yang responses, these antagonistic responses. So one hormone can come in and cause an increase in activity. Another hormone can come in and cause a decrease. That'd be your PTH calcitonin, your glucagon insulin kind of antagonistic effect. But there can also be additive effects. That is, one hormone can have an effect, and when another hormone is in the neighborhood, there can be an additive effect, right? They can increase. And this would be, when I mentioned that glucose-sparing action of growth hormone, it is even more enhanced by glucocorticoids. The word I like to use rather than additive is synergistic, right? So these hormones, they are working together better than they could by themselves. So it's synergy, right? We know what synergy is. Two things work better together than they do by themselves. So this additive effect, this synergistic effect. So you have one hormone, it can do something. You have a second hormone, it can do something. Together, they're super together. There's also permissive effects. One hormone is needed for a second hormone to do its thing. Okay? So just another combination. One hormone is needed for another one to work. Epinephrine can change cellular respiration only in the presence of thyroid, as an example. Right? So in order for one hormone to work, the other hormone must be present. It gives it, quote, permission to work. So that's a permissive effect. And then there are integrative effects. So this is when there's a coordination of all sorts of things. So calcitriol, one of the hormones involved with calcium, and PTH have overall effects. So just integration of many hormones doing the same thing. So just think about the different arrangements that hormones can work. And now I want to talk a little bit about what these hormones are doing in blood pressure. After we finish up, next we're going to go into muscle. We're going to talk about skeletal muscle and how actin and myosin work. But after we get past skeletal muscle, we'll be jumping right into cardiac muscle and into the heart. Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about some of these hormones, and you'll hear them again when we get to the cardiovascular system. All of these. The pituitary gland, the adrenal glands, the hormones made by the heart, the hormones made by the kidney, all of these hormones have an effect on blood pressure, blood volume, growth of the cardiovascular system. And here's a hormone, right? We've already talked about this one. When the heart is stretched a little bit, why would your heart be stretched? The atria get stretched because your blood pressure is too high, right? Blood volume is too high. The heart has, in the wall of the atria, a hormone called natriuretic peptide. And what's it going to do? We mentioned this one before, right? What's it going to do? What's that natriuretic hormone going to do? It's going to be released by the atria of the heart, go through the blood system, and go where? Kidneys, right? What's it going to tell the kidneys do? Let it go, flow, let it flow, right? Get rid of water. And one way you can get rid of water is to get rid of sodium. Remember, water follows solute, or solute suck. So if I have more sodium in my urine, more water will go with it. So again, more sodium is released, more water is released. It's going to suppress your thirst. This is where we talked about it before. And it's going to inhibit the release of ADH. So overall, right, you've got these integrative effects. All these hormones are going to come and affect thirst and blood volume. And we really kind of started the whole class starting out that way, didn't we? We talked about all the different ways that your body is influencing its water balance and its thirst. And we talked 3 or 4 hormones, ADH, aldosterone, renin, were all mentioned in the first few days. So here's that story again. The heart is stretched. You make the natriuretic peptide, and it causes all sorts of things to happen. It even causes dilation of your blood vessels. Well, if your blood vessels get bigger, what happens to your blood pressure? Goes down, right? So all of these different factors, all these different effects are going to collectively reduce your blood pressure. Another hormone that we talked about in 105 a little bit, erythropoietin, EPO. It's made by the kidney, mostly, a little bit by the liver, but mostly by the kidney. And when does the body make EPO? Why do we make more EPO, erythropoietin? What's it doing? What's erythropoietin? What's the word tell you it's doing? Producing more red blood cells, right? Poiesis is the formation of. So we're making more red blood cells. And this is going to increase your blood volume. The kidney is also making a hormone called renin. And renin is going to lead to fluid retention. So what do we have now? We've got natriuretic hormone telling you to lose volume. We've got renin and EPO increasing your blood volume. So now we're starting to see this regulation coming from many different places, right? It's kind of cool. The heart's involved, the kidneys are involved, lots of organs are involved in maintaining this homeostasis. So use these pictures, use these diagrams. I always say anatomy is memorize, memorize, memorize. Physiology is understand, understand, understand. When this goes up, what goes down? And be drawing arrows. I always go to a whiteboard and I say, okay, if this goes up, what have we talked about? Kind of make one of those, I'm losing the word. You just start putting like a key word up there, like blood volume. And what do you know? What increases blood volume? What decreases it? What do you call that? Diagram with all the what? Little bubbles coming out from it. What's the word I'm looking for?
Flowchart.
Flowchart. Flowchart kind of idea. Just take a piece of paper and go to a whiteboard and just start drawing out and talking about different ideas. And you'll start pulling things together. You'll start seeing connections. So we're seeing that. We saw that blood pressure and blood volume had many different hormones involved. So does growth. Your overall growth involves many endocrine glands. Some of them are independent, some of them are connected to each other, some of them are antagonistic, some of them are synergistic. And you can probably imagine which hormones I'm going to go to. Insulin, right? Taking glucose into your cells is going to increase the metabolism of your cells. PTH and calcitonin, calcitriol, I haven't mentioned it specifically, but it's in the mix as well. Those hormones, when you hear those, you think of what? You think of calcium, right? And calcium regulation would be involved with making bone. So if you're a young child and you're growing and you need to have bone growth, you better be thinking, okay, certainly the parathyroid and the thyroid gland are going to be involved in maintaining and regulating the calcium levels. The pancreas will be giving me insulin. The thyroid gland will be giving me some of the energy that I've talked about. And we also know that thyroid hormones are involved with a number of other portions of your nervous system. Then when you get to puberty, you get the reproductive hormones kicking in, right, with secondary sex characteristics. You've got testosterone and estrogen that are influencing the lengthening of bones and the growth spurts that we see. What do estrogens and progesterones do to bone? What do they tell the bone to do as far as lengthening? Well, not shorten, but stop, right? So shortly after menses begins, right, women usually reach their adult height within 18 to 24 months of menses. What's going on? The estrogen, the progesterones, especially the estrogens that are being produced now by the ovaries, are basically telling the epiphyseal plate to, or the plate to stop and for the line to be formed. Whereas testosterone actually increases the lengthening of bones. So again, there's a difference there in some of these sex hormones, but they certainly are affecting overall growth. If you look at the levels of insulin, the levels of parathyroid, the level of thyroid hormone, you'll see that there's definitely an upward level of these hormones, and then they kind of stay level or even start to drop down once puberty and adulthood is reached. Growth hormone, okay, also think about growth. Growth hormone is definitely involved with lengthening bones and developing muscle. And then during adulthood, growth hormone is still released from the anterior pituitary and is involved with energy metabolism. So you don't want too much growth hormone. Too much growth hormone can cause you to continue to grow. If you get too much growth hormone early in life, you can become a giant, right? So if you have a pituitary tumor and that pituitary tumor is spitting out growth hormone before you reach puberty, you'll just keep on growing taller. If you've already reached adulthood and then you get a pituitary tumor, then there are other consequences, and I'll be talking about a little bit of that here in a few minutes. Last thing I want to mention is stress. I create some for you, you create some for me. It's a lovely circle. Stress is basically anything that's going to shock your body and disrupt or threaten your homeostasis. That's the way of thinking about stress. Okay, so it can be any sort of thing, psychological, emotional, physical, you name it, and one hormone or many hormones are going to be affected by that, and if the hormones are affected, so too can your homeostasis. So any kind of stress response. And we're going to call this just stress response. How does your body respond to stress? And there's 3 phases to how your body's going to respond. The first is the alarm phase, right? This is the immediate thing when it happens. So this is going to be a sympathetic surge. Something is going to kick in, and you're going to respond. Epinephrine will be the major hormone at this point. And fight or flight, what are you going to do? Release energy, have energy ready to run or fight. Okay, that's going to be your alarm phase. And that's going to be coming from, right, this is going to be a conscious thought in part, somewhat conscious, some of it unconscious. And what are you going to do? You're going to send a signal down to your adrenal medulla. And the adrenal medulla is going to release what? What's it going to release? Epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? And that's going to do all the things that you would think about chasing from the bear. Heart rate, respiratory rate, all of those things go up. The second phase, though, is resistant phase. The body can't stay in a sympathetic overload for very long. So after a few hours, now epinephrine is going to come down, and now the glucocorticoids become the dominant hormones. The glucocorticoids become the dominant hormone. Epinephrine is still involved. Growth hormones involved, thyroid hormone is involved, but glucocorticoids are the big one. And when I say glucocorticoid, what hormone comes to mind? Back when I was talking about the layers of the cortex, I said mineral corticoids, think aldosterone. Glucocorticoids, I said think cortisol. Okay? Cortisol. So think cortisol here as far as a named glucocorticoid. And what this is going to do is just keep your energy levels going. And how long you stay here can vary. Okay? And so here we see this resistance phase. And we see now ACTH is being released. That's going to go down the adrenal cortex and make those glucocorticoids. Think cortisol. You're also going to have an effect on renin. That's going to keep your blood pressure up. It's going to have an effect on insulin for glucagon. What does glucagon do? Insulin tells your blood sugar to go down. Glucagon tells your blood sugar to go up, right? It's releasing energy stores for you to maintain this stressful time in your life. Then finally, there's the exhaustion phase. Now, when this happens, this can be, you can think about this in different ways. You can think about this being short term, like a few hours, or even long term. And at some point, your body can't stay in this high revved up stage for very long. And at some point, the energy reserves will start to fall. And no longer can the body maintain homeostasis, because that's really what the body was trying to do, right? During the resistance phase, it was really just trying desperately to keep things as even as possible, even during this time of stress. But at some point, it can no longer do that. Now, at that point, right, you're going to start having some organ issues, you're going to start having electrolyte issues, and we know enough to know if our calcium gets out of whack, if our sodium gets out of whack, if our potassium gets out of whack, now we got issues with our heart, our brain, our nervous system, and you name it, all sorts of things can happen. And basically the end of this is death, right? So hopefully, right, all of us get to a point of decreasing that stress before we get to this stage. Now imagine someone who's overseas in the military, right, who's in active combat, right? And they're in that constant stage of alertness. Or forget military, think about a single mom or a single parent, right, who's always got stresses. Maybe some of you can relate with that. You've got the stresses of job and children and money and finances and me, right, all this stuff mixed together. That can keep you in this responsive phase for quite some time. And at some point, we all do reach exhaustion. There's some breaking point, and we just have to chill, right? Or else our health will be negatively affected. So put this in a common sense kind of thing, and I think this whole idea about stress will make good sense to you. So the last few slides are really what I want you to realize is what goes wrong when the hormones are too high, or what can go wrong when the hormones are too low, right? So be watching for excessive and hypo or hypersecretion of these hormones as I flip through this list of disorders. What would cause hyposecretion? Overall, what would cause hyposecretion of a hormone? Either damage to that gland, right? Damage to that gland. It could be some disruption to the circulation supply to that gland. It could be some other thing, like if I don't have enough iodine, then I can't make thyroid hormone. So there could be a metabolic or a blood flow issue or damage to a gland that would release or would cause a hyposecretion. Or you could have been born with a gland that was just too small to keep up with your adult body, and it can't get ahead of the game. Or maybe you're missing an enzyme or a receptor, like type 2 diabetes, where the receptors aren't working anymore. Or maybe you don't have the receptors altogether. So you're born with some genetic predisposition to this. Okay, so what are the different ways that you have a hyposecretion? There can also be, well, I've already mentioned this, right? There can be abnormal receptors. So what I'm going through is just what can cause the onset of these different types of disorders. Here's one, acromegaly. What's acro mean? Acro. Extreme, extremity. Okay? So acromegaly, megaly is an enlargement. So acromegaly would be enlargement of your extremities. And this is what happens if you get too much growth hormone after puberty. You've already reached your adult height, and now this is Shrek. This is Andre the Giant, right? This is it Verona, right? Shrek's wife, right? So big face, big hands, very big changes in their extremities as a result. So a person would have a rather normal looking face, and then you start seeing their jaw, and this isn't the most extreme case, but just think Shrek, okay? That's acromegaly. There could be a problem with the thyroid gland. A goiter, I mentioned before, Dr. Morton got involved with the US government and they started putting iodine in our salt. There were a lot of enlarged thyroid glands because of not enough iodine. There can, however, be also congenital disorders where the thyroid gland does not keep up. So here's a goiter, right? We don't see this in our country much anymore, okay? But in a lot of cultures where there isn't enough iodine, you get these big, big goiters, enlargements of the thyroid gland. Addison's disease, Cushing's disease. Addison's disease is a hyposecretion of the corticosteroids. Cushing's disease is a hypersecretion. So here's the yin-yang. Addison's disease is not enough. Cushing's disease is too much. Cushing's disease, they start getting a lot of fat around the base of their neck and their cheeks. Right now, though, I just want you to, when you go back into your hormone list, stick these names of these diseases next to the gland, right, for disorders, hypo and hypersecretion. And there's some beautiful tables in there for you to review, so look at those things. And that, gets us through. Kind of fast at the end, but look through those different disorders on the endocrine hypo and hypersecretion. Now, on Blackboard, on mastering, I did post homework the other night. You've got a homework assignment. They're not terribly long. I was very conscious of how long the homework assignments are in mastering. But you'll find a mastering assignment on the autonomic nervous system. That lecture was only an hour if you haven't had a chance to listen to it. And then we've had 2 talks over the endocrine system, and that homework is also in mastering. And you'll find a homework assignment on Chapter 6. Now, I'm going to be very selective on what I'm going to cover in Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is about skeletal system. It's about bone and osteocytes, and it's about canaliculi and lamella. I'm not going to review all that stuff. I'm going to look in specifically at bone formation, how cartilage becomes bone, and then we'll tie back in how calcitonin and parathyroid hormone are critically important in bone development. So we'll be talking more about the homeostasis and the metabolism of bone, not bone structure, not naming bones. That's old stuff.
Is this the case study supposed to be assigned today?
Thank you. Case study. I can put those out there now. I don't want you to worry about them, though, until after the test, okay? I'll talk about this in lab, and Mr. Mueller as well. Thank you for the reminder. I've got 2 case study assignments for you to do. The case studies most naturally are something you can do with your lab group. You've gotten to know your lab group pretty well. You're doing a research project with them, with the lab, with the muscle physiology. Most of the groups I've seen have been working pretty well together. So the lab groups are a natural place for you to work in these little case studies. What I'll do is I'll post on Blackboard a collection of case studies. These are put out by the University of Buffalo, and they're short stories and then some questions after. It's kind of a different way of learning about human physiology. And you will have quite a few to choose from. There'll be 2 sets of them, and you'll choose one from each set. The first set of case studies will have something to do with, if I remember right, scientific method and nervous system. And the second set will have something to do with endocrine disorders. Okay? And I'll give you like 5 or 6 choices in each category. Your group will choose one from the first group and one from the second group. Read through them, answer the questions, and submit them. I'll be flexible with the due date. I have a due date on there of when.
I think it's like the day after.
Is it after spring break or before? It should be after, right?
I don't know. It was the 26th.
Of February? I'll put it further out, okay? Because we got to worry about this test first, and then we have a lab exam coming up next week as well. So I'll get a better story about this going on. I'll put them out there, okay? But I don't want you worrying about it until after the lab exam is over with and the lecture exam next week. And then I'll push the due date out a little bit and give you more headways on that. But thank you for the reminder.